don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. Never stop, you never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Oh, you are. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Oh, 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 that is who you are. That is who you are. Oh, that is who you are. That is who you are. That is who you are. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keep, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keep, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are.
Good morning, First Baptist Greenwood. We are so glad to be here with you this morning on behalf of your brothers and sisters in Fayetteville. We bring you greetings. These guys lead worship for our college ministry and in our church as a whole often, and we're glad to share them with you, and we're glad to be here with you this morning. Thank you for your hospitality. It has been a great weekend for us as we enjoyed being here in your city and with your church. I've been amazed at how involved your church staff is in Disciple Now, and that is such a good sign, such a sign of good health that so many of your pastors are invested in your young people and wanting to reach the next generation. Has been a beautiful picture of the church. On behalf of my family, thank you for hosting us. I've got my wife and 3 children here with you this morning. My wife is somewhere in this room with a 3-year-old, probably chasing him around there. And I see them on the back row back there. That's because the 3-year-old gets a little antsy and may want to make a break for it at some point. My oldest son, he's 11 years old. He's up in the top way up there. He was running slides for the music team. He gets to do that sometimes, and Jared even paid him $5 to do it this weekend. So he's got his job and his role, and then we have a 9-year-old daughter that's wherever 3rd graders are on your campus, and so she's hanging out with them. And you've hosted us well. You've been hospitable to us over this weekend. It's been a joy to be here with you. If you have your Bible, grab that and go to the book of Luke. Luke chapter 15 is where we're going to be. We're going to look at an incredibly familiar story. Even if you're not a Christian, even if you don't know much about the Bible, you probably know this story. And having been with your students all weekend, having invested, and this is my 4th time to preach this weekend, and the next service will be my 5th time to preach this weekend. So we've been in the scripture a bunch, and every time I've opened the word with them, then they've gone to a small group, and either before or after I preach, they've discussed what we've talked about and these issues. We've talked about this theme from Abide from John chapter 15, where Jesus says, I am the vine and you are the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing, and what it means to be connected to Jesus and stay connected to Jesus and how that shows up in our life. And so they've been in the word. They've opened their Bibles. They've had discussions about it. They've heard sermons. They've been a part of worship services. They probably sang more worship services this weekend than they ever have in their life in a single weekend. They probably open the scripture more in this one weekend than they do all year long. And I close with this. Here's my fear of what could happen after a weekend like that. My fear for what would happen to a high school student or a teenager who has been in Bible study all weekend long, worshiped all weekend long, and then we come to the end of the weekend. What could happen? What could go wrong? Now, everybody's afraid of something. And I know the Bible tells us not to fear, and we want to just say, yeah, Jesus said don't fear, don't be anxious. Yeah, and that's great, and we should listen to what Jesus said. But we're all at least a little afraid of something. Everybody has that phobia. And so some of the most popular phobias, actually often what is listed as the most popular fear among people is public speaking. Jerry Seinfeld did a comedy routine one time where he said the number 1 fear is public speaking and the number 2 fear is death, which means that at the funeral, you would rather be the one in the casket than the one giving the eulogy, right? And so we're afraid of things. My little silly fear that my kids know about is I'm afraid of sharks. I grew up in the 80s and saw a Jaws movie when I was a kid, and that was it for me in the ocean, right? Like, I don't want to be in the ocean. Actually, I'll go to the beach, and I'll get into knee-high water, but Shark Week on Discovery Channel, not my thing. I mean, I'm fascinated by sharks, but I'm afraid of them. I know that if I'm in the water, I'm in their territory, and there's nothing I can do to stop them if they want to do something. Maybe you're afraid of snakes or spiders or all those different fears. Maybe it is public speaking or sharks like me, but everybody's afraid of something. What's my fear for students at the end of the weekend like this? I got to tell you, my fear for students at the end of the weekend like this is the same that is my greatest fear for my children, which is the same as my greatest fear for church members who sit in services every Sunday. And before I tell you what that fear is, I want to give you a picture of it in this story that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 15. In Luke chapter 15, Jesus tells 3 stories. You know them. They're familiar stories. There's the story of the lost sheep. A man loses one of his 100 sheep, and he leaves the 99, goes and finds the one sheep. And he tells the story of a woman who has 10 coins, and she loses one of her 10 coins. And then she goes and searches and sweeps the house until she finds her coin, and then rejoices that she finds her coin. And then we get to verse 11, and Jesus tells what is literally one of the most famous stories ever. In fact, the famous British author Charles Dickens, who wrote Great Expectations and David Copperfield and A Christmas Carol, said this was the greatest story ever written. That what we come to in Luke chapter 15, starting verse 11, that we often call the Prodigal Son, the story of the Prodigal Son, that it was one of the greatest stories ever told, ever written. And what's the story about? It's about a father and 2 sons. Look at verse 11. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. And he's going to tell us the story of this man and his 2 sons. And generally, the first son that we're going to meet, the younger son, is the one who gets the most attention, and I think rightly so. But really, there are 3 main characters in this story. And they all contribute to the story. There's something significant happening in the story from all 3 of these characters. The father, the older son, and the younger son. And the first one we meet, the first one that we really understand what's going on in his life is the younger son, is the one that we call the prodigal. Look with me in verse 12. Here's what it says about the younger son. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. Now, this is a sad, tragic, even scandalous story that we just read. There are some things happening that if you don't know the culture of what's going on here, that maybe don't shock you, but certainly to the people that Jesus was telling the story to, the first hearers of the story, they would have heard some of the details in this story and would have been shocked by them. Because what we have in this story, in this younger man, is we have a man who is, sometimes we make this caricature of, he's a man who just likes to party. He's a man who wants to sow his young oats. Right? He wants to sow his oats, but really what we see in this person is that he is marked by outright rebellion. That's the story of the younger son. He is marked by outright rebellion. The very first thing we learn about the younger son in verse 12 is that he goes to his father and he makes a request. And it may sound like, Father, I'd like to spend and enjoy my money while you can see me enjoy it. Like, that's become a thing these days, right? People get their inheritance a little early. Grandparents will say to their grandkids, I want to give you, I know people who are in this situation who have said to me, yeah, my grandfather gave me my inheritance early because he wants to see me enjoy it. He's given me this money. He wants to see me invest it wisely, maybe help me buy a house or buy my first car or something like that. They've given me my inheritance early. But in this culture, when this young man goes to his father and says, Father, divide up the property and give me my inheritance, essentially this is what he's saying to his father. You're better off dead to me. Because when do you get your inheritance? You get your inheritance when the father dies. And this young son, the younger of the sons, has the audacity to go to his father and say, Father, we're not going to follow any of the normal regulations of how this works. Really, I am not interested in any kind of relationship with you. I just want the money. And that would have been scandalous to the hearer. For this young man to say, Father, you're better off to me dead. Give me my share of the inheritance now. What's even more scandalous in some sense is that then the father actually does it. Like, I don't know what it was like when you made odd requests to your parents. Maybe you talked back to your parents. Maybe you gave some attitude to your parents. Most of us know that when we made a request like this, when we showed this kind of attitude, the response of our parents wasn't, sure, you can have it. It's even scandalous that the father actually does what the son says. That when he says, you're better off to me dead, just give me my share of the inheritance, the father actually gives it to him. And then we see what he does with it. I mean, he goes off and what does he do? Not many days later, verse 13, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. This is scandal number 2. First he says to his father, you're better off to me dead. Then what does he do? He leaves his community, which is not something you did in this time. He leaves the family. He leaves the community. He is turning his back on them. He's marked by outright rebellion. I just want the money. I don't want you. And then he leaves. And he demonstrates that that's really where his heart was. He didn't care about his family. He didn't care about his father. He leaves them all behind. Scandalous again. Now, the key to abide, and what we've talked about all weekend, is that word means you stay. The whole premise of abide for Jesus is I want to stay where Jesus is. I'm not going to leave Jesus. I'm not going to walk away with Jesus. So all weekend long, we talked about what it means to stay with Jesus and not to be someone who walks away from Jesus. And we saw that in John 15 and in 1 John chapter 2. This son is not an abider. He's not someone who stays. He's the one who left. And not just left physically, but literally turns his back on his family and says, I'm done with you. And the whole idea is that he's done with them, and by walking away, his community is saying, and we're done with you. If you leave, don't come back. That's the understanding of the culture, that this kind of outright rebellion, I'm taking my money, I'm turning my back on you, I'm leaving, that's what he does. And even the community is essentially saying, you can go, but don't come back. You've turned your back on us. You've rejected us. He is living in outright rebellion. And then, of course, we see that play out. What happens? He goes and he spends it, verse 13. He squandered his property in reckless living. He wastes his money. He does just want to party. He does just want to live it up in his youth. He does just want to sow his wild oats. And he's taken that money that he's gotten from his father, turned his back on his family, and he uses it for his sinful lifestyle. And then what we find in verse 14 is that led to serious consequences. That his outright rebellion and rejection of his family and rejection of his culture and rejection of his community and walking away from them led to serious consequences. Some that maybe he should have foreseen, some he didn't foresee. That maybe he shouldn't have squandered his wealth. Maybe he should have been saving that. Maybe he shouldn't have taken it early when he didn't know what to do with it. And he uses that, spends his money, becomes the guy who's always picking up the tab. He becomes the guy who's always paying for the meals. He's using his wealth to gain all these friends and to build community around him because he's rejected the community that he left. And now he has to create this new community. And he's using his wealth to do that. And then all of a sudden, everything changes in verse 14. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. And now the inheritance that he had is gone. And the hope is maybe he spent it in a way that he has made a connection. Maybe he has built a community and someone that's going to help him out. But look at what happens in verse 15. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country who sent him into his field to feed pigs. This may not look like rock bottom to you, but for a first century Jewish man, this is the bottom of the bottom of the bottom. He needs a job. He can't rely on his family and his community anymore who would have taken care of him because he's rejected them. He's walked away from them. So he goes and finds a job in this country, and they send him to feed the pigs. And for a first century Jew, the dirtiest and most unclean animals on the planet, the ones that were ceremonially unclean, the ones that were physically unclean, was the pig. And this guy finds himself not only feeding the pigs, but here's what we find in the next verse. He's actually jealous of the pigs. Of this animal that would have been thought of in his home country as something that was totally filthy and totally to be avoided. Now he is right there in the slop with the pigs and jealous that they're eating better than he is. And he says he longed to even eat their food. And then we have this incredibly sad verse at the end of verse 16, this incredibly sad phrase, and no one gave him anything. We have the story of this man who's marked by outright rebellion. And in his outright rebellion, he ends up bankrupt. He ends up with nothing. He goes to absolute rock bottom. And maybe you can think of some situations like this, that when we consider what's our fear for our teenagers, what's our fear for young people, what's our fear for our kids and people in our community, sometimes this is our fear. That they will pursue things that the world says this is going to satisfy you, that they will pursue things that the world says this is what you should do as a teenager, that you should sow your wild oats. And so often what we see are those teenagers, those college students, those young people hit rock bottom. And their life spins out of control as they pursue things that are never going to satisfy them. That as they turn their back maybe on their community and certainly on Jesus, as they walk away from Jesus, not abiding in Jesus, and oftentimes they hit rock bottom. They experience rebellion and the consequences of that. Sometimes we see them rejecting their faith, and we see them hitting rock bottom. But here's what happens to the young man. The very next phrase says, and then he came to himself. He gets an idea. He realizes, this is the worst. What can I do? And look what he says in verse 17. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. So here's the plan. He realizes, I've burned some bridges. My outright rebellion, me going to my father and saying, just give me the money. I want the money. I don't want you. I wish you were dead. I turn my back on you. I turn my back on my community. I turn my back on my family. He realizes that has some long-lasting consequences. And he realizes, I can't go back home and be a son. That's his speech. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But his idea is, maybe I can get a job there. If I can't be a son, maybe I can be a servant. And he works up the nerve, and he gets it. He works on his speech, and he figures it out. Okay, when I see my dad, here's what I'm going to say. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Hire me as your servant. I'll work for you. I've sinned against heaven before you. He recognizes his wrong. No longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. That's his plan. He recognizes his sin. He comes to himself. He understands his reality. I'm going to return as a slave. His plan is to earn his way back into the community. So note this. This son who is marked by outright rebellion and the serious consequences of outright rebellion, he has no hope of reconciliation with his father. He has no hope of being brought back into the family. His only hope is being brought in as a slave, as a servant, with the hope that he can earn just enough money that he doesn't starve to death. That's his plan. That's the younger son. That's the one who gets the most attention in the story. If you thought the story was scandalous before, wait till you see what happens next. As we meet not just the older son, but now we turn our attention to the father. As we meet the father in verses 20 through 24, here's what we find. If the younger son was marked by outright rebellion and the serious consequences of that outright rebellion, the father is marked by overwhelming mercy and grace. What happens next is unbelievable. If you're hearing the story for the first time, I think people are wondering. Here's what they're wondering as the younger son makes his way back to the father. As he comes up with this plan, the question on most people's mind is the plan going to work? Will the father even take him as a servant? Will he even put him to work in the fields? Will the guy find a way back into the community? And it would be incredible mercy and grace for this younger son to even find his way back in the community, to have a job that enables him to have the food that he needs to not starve to death. But look at what happens in verse 20. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the incredible mercy and grace that we see in those few short phrases in verse 20 is incredible. Some things that should stand out for us is not only the father saw him, but the father's the first description of the father when he sees the son is he felt compassion. Not he felt vindicated. Can you imagine this father whose son looked him in the eye and said, I'm better off without you. And now he sees him dragging himself back into the community. You and I probably would have been tempted to say, I told you so. You got what you deserved. Why didn't you listen to me? No, he felt compassion. And then he does something that should jump off the page to us. He ran. And that's a big deal because in this culture, the older men in the community, the elders of the community, did not run. Everyone waited on them. It was even somewhat shameful for someone like this man in his place in the community to run, to do something quickly. He's supposed to be the one that everyone else waits on. And when he gets there, that's when it starts. When he arrives, that's when the important things happen. But he runs to his son, I think for two reasons. One, because he's so moved with compassion and mercy to see his son that he's not looking for vindication. He's not looking for the I told you so moment. He is looking for reconciliation with his son. He is hoping for reconciliation for his son. He is on the watch, watching on the horizon, waiting for his son to return to him. And he's so moved with compassion that he loses control and runs to his son. Also, it's probably to protect his son. His son has not only rejected the father, but the entire community. And as one who has rejected the entire community, there would have been plenty of people who would have wanted to remind this son, maybe with their words, maybe with more than their words, that he had rejected them and he didn't belong here. But the father runs to his son. He has compassion on him. He runs to him. He embraces him and he kisses him. And then the son, in this moment, who I'm sure is overwhelmed by the mercy and the compassion of the father, then he realizes it's time to start my speech. It's time to tell my father this thing that I worked up in my mind so that I can earn my way back into the community. So he starts his speech, verse 21. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And it's supposed to continue. He's got more to say. The plan is, don't treat me as your son. Hire me as one of your servants. I'll work in the fields. That's what I'm going to do. But look at what happens, verse 22. The father cuts him off. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. And put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. What's happening here in the moment is the father is saying to the son and to the community, here's the role that this person is going to play. His hope was to come in as a servant, but what the father is saying is, I am reinstating you as a son. Even though you rejected me, even though you took the wealth and you squandered it, even though you rejected the community, even though everything that happened that we knew was going to happen, happened, he doesn't invite him back in as a servant. He invites him back in as a son. Bring quickly the best robe. Who would have had the best robe in the house? The father. Bring my robe and put it on him. And put a ring on his hand. This son will have the authority of the family. He will be marked as someone who is an authority in the family, and put shoes on his feet. Why is it significant that they're going to put shoes on his feet? Even this morning on the news, they're talking about how you should take your shoes off whenever you come into your house. That when you come into your house, if you don't take your shoes off, you're bringing all kinds of dangerous bacteria into your home. So what they were indicating is you should wear shoes outside and not wear shoes inside. But it's a little bit opposite in the first century. If you were wearing shoes, you weren't working in the field. So we would put our shoes on to go out into the fields and to work and then take those muddy boots off when we get back into the house. When he puts shoes on his feet, he is saying, you're not here to work. You're not going to be in the fields. You're not going to be out there. You're going to be right in here with me. That the Father is reinstating him into the family. It doesn't stop there, verse 23. And here's the strain that puts together all three of the stories that he tells in Luke chapter 15. And bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine, this my son, was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. The Father meets the Son with compassion, brings him back into the family, reconciles him fully, and then throws a party and celebrates with him. And celebrates with the community and invites the community in to say, my son has returned. He was dead and is alive. He was lost and has been found. And we are going to celebrate that. We see the incredible mercy and grace of the Father here. And there is so much hope here. There's so much hope in this story. If you identify with the prodigal, hear this story. Hear the incredible mercy and compassion. If you identify with the prodigal, if even right now in your life or at some point in your life you are marked by outright rebellion against God, maybe rebellion against the church, or rebellion against your family, if you are marked by those things, then this story is about you. It's about the incredible, life-changing mercy that is available to you, to those who turn from their sins and return to their Father. It's an incredible story of mercy and grace, that those who have wandered far away, those who have done so much that they think they could never return, what do they find when they return? When you turn from your sin and turn to God, when you have rejected him, rejected your family, rejected your church, and run away and have hit rock bottom, what should you expect to find when you come back to God? Incredible mercy and grace. Unbelievable mercy and grace, and not the kind of mercy and grace that says, we'll let you back in so that you can earn your way back in. The incredible mercy and grace that says, I don't need a servant. I'm bringing you in as a child. That I'm reconciling you fully into the family of God. If that's you, hear the incredible mercy and grace about this story. There's so much hope here, which is why all that we read so far in the story is not my greatest fear for your teenagers. My greatest fear for your teenagers is not that they're the prodigal. So often we read the story and our response is, man, I'm glad I'm not the prodigal. But this would be a great place to end the story. Jesus told 3 stories here, and they almost all end right at this moment. That once the lost thing is found, that's the end of the story. The lost thing is found, celebration, end of story. Found the sheep, celebrate, end of story. Found the coin, celebrate, end of story. Found the son, celebrate, not the end of story. Something else happens in the story. The story is about the younger brother. It's about the prodigal, but the story is actually for the older brother. The story is for those of us who don't identify with the prodigal, but those of us who identify with the other son in this story. It's for those of you who identify with the older brother. In fact, the whole context of this, go back with me, Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 1, he says this, now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, that is Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man, Jesus, receives sinners and eats with them. So who is Jesus telling the story about? He's telling the story about sinners, about tax collectors and sinners. But who is he telling the story to, and who is he telling the story for? Religious people. People who would not identify with tax collectors and sinners. People who would not say that I've walked away from God. People who would not say that I'm the prodigal. People who would hear the story of the prodigal and say, that's not me. So Jesus introduces the other character in the story, verse 25. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. Verse 28, he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, "Look, these many years I have served you. I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to his son, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." And here's the description of the older brother. He is marked by pride and self-reliance, not understanding his own need for the father's incredible mercy. Three characters in the story. A father marked by incredible mercy and grace. A son who makes terrible mistakes and understands his need for this incredible mercy and grace. And then this son who says, "I don't really need that. I don't really need the mercy and grace of God." What happens is this episode exposes the heart of the older brother. And he's marked by the same rebellious heart as the younger brother. He's got the same attitude of, "I want to be a servant, not a son." That's what he says in verse 28. But he was angry and refused to go to his father, and he refused to go in, and his father came out and entreated him. And here, what does he say to his father? Verse 29. "Look, these many years, I've served you." He's not talking like a son. He's talking like a servant. And here's his problem. The one who didn't deserve it got the party. And I deserve this. I should get this. I've earned this. Why haven't you done this for me? And then he exposes his heart in another way because he says, "All these years I've served you, and you never even gave me a goat." And then who does he want to celebrate with? For me to celebrate with my friends. Does he want the relationship with the Father? No. I'm working for you, Father, so that I can earn what I want, so I can go do what I want. He's actually got the same kind of heart as the younger son. He's got the prodigal's heart. He just happened to stay. And the reason I chose this story, as we think about abide, is because in this story we have someone who stayed, but not really. We have someone who walked away and someone who stayed. But even the one who stayed, even the one who we would look at him and say, he abided. He didn't leave. He remained. He physically stayed, but his heart didn't stay. It looked right on the outside, but it wasn't right on the inside. The younger son who makes immense mistakes but finds even greater mercy, that's who we often look at. But don't miss, there is an older son who thinks he is good enough and doesn't need any mercy. And how do you know if maybe that's you? When you read the story of the prodigal son, is your first reaction, "I'm glad I'm not the prodigal. That's not me. I'm glad I never made any of those mistakes." Yes, the prodigal makes huge mistakes, but he's also the one who finds mercy. And at the end of the story, he is the one who is reconciled to the Father. He is the one who has the right relationship to the Father. Do you read the story? Do you hear the story and say, "I'm glad I'm not the prodigal? I'm glad that's not me"? When really, it would be better off for us to be the prodigal in the story. It would be better off for us to say, "My life and my past is marked by huge mistakes, but I found the mercy of God." Now, when the story ends, we don't know what happens to the older son. But he's at least in a place where his attitude is, "I don't need you. I don't need the Father. I don't need your mercy and your grace. I've earned this, and I wish that you treated me differently." And that is my greatest fear for your teenagers. My greatest fear for your teenagers, my greatest fear for my children, my greatest fear for church members and people who sit in services Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. My greatest fear is not that people are going to go get drunk with their friends. My greatest fear is not that people are going to practice immorality in their relationships or any of those things. None of those things are good. I hope none of those things happen. But that's not my greatest fear for your teenagers. My greatest fear for you. As I think about my children, there are some things I never want to hear from my children. There's some conversations I hope never happen with my children. I fear these conversations. I don't want them to happen. I don't want the phone to ring one of these days and hear this: "Dad, I got arrested again." can you come get me? Again. I don't want to hear that phone call. I don't want to have that conversation. I don't want to hear, Dad, I'm pregnant, and I don't know who the father is. I don't want to hear, Dad, I was pregnant, and I didn't know what to do. I don't want to hear and have to say to my children, you have to choose between us and the drugs. You have to choose between us and the drinking. I don't ever want to have any of those conversations. And I pray to God I never do. But those are not my greatest fear. My greatest fear is not that I have to bail my children out of jail or deal with the fallout of a pregnancy or a terminated pregnancy or the drugs and the alcohol. It's not my greatest fear. As a pastor, can I tell you, my greatest fear is that my children will sit in service after service after service and hear sermon after sermon after sermon, and that your teenagers will hear 5 sermons in a weekend and spend all weekend hearing about the Bible and worshiping and doing all the church things and think, I'm good enough. I don't need a Savior. And you would be shocked how many people are sitting in service after service after service, and their response to the prodigal son is, I'm not the prodigal. That's not me. I'm good. I've behaved. I've been in Sunday school. I've been in church. I've done all the things right. I don't really need anything from God. When the truth is, every single son in the story desperately needed the mercy and the grace of the compassionate Father. And only one of them finds it. The one who made the big mistakes. It was the one who behaved well. It was the one who thought he was good enough that everyone would have pointed to and said, that's the one to be proud of. Who at the end of the story has yet to experience the mercy and the grace of God. So here's how we'll close. Are you the prodigal? Does the story describe your story? If you're the prodigal, then this story is about you. And here's the invitation. Come home. Is your life marked by rebellion? Come home. One of the things I said to the students last night is don't walk away from Jesus because only Jesus satisfies and only Jesus saves. Come home. Come to Jesus. If your life is the prodigal, are you the older brother? The one who thinks they don't really need the mercy and the grace? This story is for you. Are you the prodigal? It's about you. Or the older brother, the story is for you. What do you do? Verse 32, it was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. And we have this open-ended conclusion to the story. And so the hearers would have said at first, what's going to happen when the younger son gets home? And now the hearer says, what's going to happen to the older brother? And we never find out. But Jesus is offering these religious leaders that he identified in chapter 15, verse 1, who said, this guy eats with sinners. This guy eats with tax collectors. He eats with people who don't deserve God's grace. And Jesus says that's the whole point. Nobody deserves God's grace. And he invites them to identify themselves in the story and come and be a part of it. So here's the invitation if you identify with the older son, not only to join the celebration of others finding forgiveness and restoration, but realizing that we need the same restoration. We need the same mercy and grace. Are you the prodigal? Come home and find mercy. Are you not the prodigal? Come home and find mercy. Amen. Will you pray with me?